to our first webinar in our series funded by CIHR as part of our SPOR grant for our ATTACH study. And I'm even more delighted to introduce Dr. Ian Graham. And we go back quite a few years. I think we first met around 2006 when I was on CIHR Governing Council, and Ian was Vice President of Knowledge Translation at CIHR. And you were always my favorite VP, Ian. And I'll never forget when you told me, I don't know if you remember telling me this, maybe tell it to everyone, but you said everyone needs to do knowledge translation, whether it be for love or money. Those words have stuck with me over the years. But more seriously, Dr. Graham is a McGill trained medical sociologist whose research program has evolved to encompass knowledge translation or implementation science. A core component of his research program focuses on understanding how engaging patients and other stakeholders in the research process, known as integrated knowledge translation, works and the impact it produces. He is co-originator of the Knowledge to Action framework, which many of you may be aware of. He has published over 300 peer-reviewed articles and is co-editor of the seminal texts in the field, including Turning Knowledge into Action, published in 2014, Knowledge Translation Healthcare, now in its second edition. And he has been twice awarded a Queen Elizabeth II Jubilee Medal, first in 2002 and again in 2012, for his outstanding contributions to research. He's also an inducted fellow of prestigious academies, including the Canadian Academies of Health Sciences, the New York Academy of Medicine, and the Royal Society of Medicine. And he's just a really great guy. So, just really delighted to have you here, Ian, and I'll just turn it over to you and I'll mute myself.
Thank you very much, Nicole. And Nicole was right. We first met when she was on Governing Council and I was at CIHR, and I was there for 6 years. And I like to say that the first 3 years were the best of times for me. And then the next 3, the president changed, and they were the worst of times. And so one of the nice things about being at CIHR was all of the great people that I got to meet and interact with. So thank you for that introduction. So today we're going to have a little bit of a casual presentation. We have some polls that we think will work. If they don't, then we'll use them as reflective moments. So we'll see how it goes. Nicole has mentioned some of my disclosures already, so know where I'm coming from. The one thing, though, that I should mention is I have a CIHR Foundation grant focused on studying integrated knowledge translation or research co-production. And so that's, a particular research interest of mine right at the moment. So over the next 45 to 50 minutes or so, I'd like to kind of give a very high level overview of knowledge translation, and then end of project or end of grant knowledge translation, a little bit about integrated knowledge translation, and there's a seminar series later on in the year that's devoted exclusively to knowledge translation. And then, which is, the title was implementation science, but I actually think implementation science falls under knowledge translation. So a very brief introduction. So if you were hoping to learn everything there is about the science, unfortunately, you're going to be disappointed. So adjust your expectations. So the latest research shows that we really should do something with all this research. And in a couple of years, it's going to be, we've got great findings that shows the ATTACH intervention works for all sorts of kids and parents in all sorts of contexts. We need this to be used everywhere, in Canada, beyond Canada. And this is the challenge. We have lots of research, and it really doesn't get into practice or policy. And it's really self-evident that if we have this research and nobody acts on it, and if we're thinking in the health context, and I will try not to always talk about health, but that is my context as opposed to social care, for example. If we're not using those findings, then the patient and public are not benefiting from the results, from all of the great innovations that have been produced that are evidence informed. And the health system is actually not going to be as efficient and effective as it could be. And you're probably well aware of these kinds of gaps. So these statistics actually come from Holland, the US, Australia. Janet Squires is doing a similar study that I'm on at the moment in Canada. They're all kind of the same. 30 to 45% of patients actually don't get treatments of proven effectiveness. So this isn't about we need to do another study because we're not sure what to do. We've done the studies. No more studies are needed. We know that it either adopting the innovation improves health, or we're doing things that have been proven, which is the second category, up to 25% of things that people get, and these studies are often done in hospital. So they'll take a period of time and then they'll look at a patient and look at all of the things that went wrong or the patient has wrong, and then see were they treated appropriately. And between 20 and 25% of patients get care that isn't actually needed or is potentially harmful. So that's the concern about overuse. And then Braithwaite and colleagues in Australia have looked at the literature in a slightly different way, but essentially came up with the same thing. So, but framed maybe in a little bit more positive. So 60% of the care would seem to be based on guidelines and consensus-based guidelines. 30% is waste or low value. So we could probably ditch it and save a lot of time and effort, which would be good for sustaining the healthcare system. And then about 10% of things that people have done to them are actually harmful. So that's the category of they need to be abandoned, and they should have been abandoned years ago. And why do we keep doing things? So the context of we have these huge evidence practice gaps. And so where does knowledge translation come into it? And so before we get there, there's the issue of all sorts of terminology that just kind of litters this field and doesn't really help a whole lot. And so I'd encourage everybody, when you're reading in the area or interacting with people, don't assume if they're using the same words as you, they're actually talking about the same thing, because they may not be. And so the notion of knowledge transfer was, I'm really smart, I'm a researcher, and the only problem here is that you're kind of ignorant, and all I need to do is transfer from me to you. So you're really kind of unimportant in the process, and all I need to do is get the information to you, and you will be enlightened and the world would be fixed. And of course, we know that that doesn't work, and the notion has largely fallen out of favor, except our preoccupation with social media kind of goes back to this notion, right? This is just another way to get information to people, and then the world will be fine. And Jonathan Lomas and others said, well, maybe we actually need to be thinking of this as a two-way street, and that the people are not just passive recipients. They should also be influencing what the research that's being done. So that's knowledge exchange. For those from the nursing discipline, a long tradition going back to the 70s focused on research use and research utilization, and the important distinction between knowledge and research. And of course, research is a subcomponent of, or information that's generated from research is a subcomponent of knowledge, but there's other ways of knowing than empirically. And so that's another thing to be paying attention to. Are we just wanting people to use research findings, or can they use research findings mixed with experiential knowledge, legal knowledge, philosophy, whatever? And then we, in some of our work, preferred the term knowledge to action because it was a little bit more intuitive, that people kind of, we have information, we have knowledge, we have evidence, we have something, and we want something to happen based on it. And then in the US, and this is sort of the early 2000s, it was implementation and implementation science, and the preeminent journal in healthcare is implementation science, and common also in Australia and in Canada and in the United Kingdom. And then if you're from the social science and humanities community, it's knowledge mobilization. And I actually kind of favor that term. I think it kind of conjures up the right kind of issue. It is about moving the knowledge around, and that term is used in Australia and the UK in kind of spots. And then we have knowledge translation, which is primarily a Canadian term, which might be okay, except because we're, a multilingual country. translation has, linguistic translation, technical translation, all of the kinds of translations which throw people off. So what is, and if you look on the left-hand side, you've got whatever's produced from research. So it could be a paper, it could be discovery, it could be the attach intervention. And so I'm going to refer to the attached intervention and the attach project as Find Waldo. So in the presentation, when I say Find Waldo, in the slide, figure out where the attach piece is. But so we have research outputs, and what we want are impacts. And that may be more knowledge. It may be people aligning their practice with that new knowledge. It may be to create profit, commercialization, so KT for love or for money, all sorts of impacts. And the historical notion was, well, all you had to do was do the research and magically somehow all of these things happened. And so knowledge translation is essentially the bridge. It's the pathway to impact. What needs to happen for those outputs to actually become impacts? And it can be the practice of knowledge translation, so facilitating the use of research, or it can be studying it, which would be implementation science. And I'll talk about that a little bit more. So I mentioned that KT was a Canadian term largely, and it actually comes from the act, the parliamentary act that created CIHR. And in the act, it said CIHR was responsible for creating new knowledge based on international standards and its translation into improved, and this is after the first green, improved health for Canadians, more effective health services and products, and a strengthened healthcare system. That's the actual wording that's in the act when CIHR was created. And so that's where somebody in their infinite wisdom said, oh, we should call it knowledge translation. So that was before my time. And they could have said we should call it research translation because at CIHR, we only fund research. But I think they were really forward thinking in realizing that maybe just saying research translation was too narrow. So a dynamic and iterative process that involves synthesis, dissemination, exchange, and ethically sound application of knowledge. And I'm going to go through that in a minute. And then that second paragraph, and I'll let you read it, is essentially saying there are people who create knowledge and there's people who use knowledge, and sometimes they're the same people and sometimes they're different people, and how they interact with each other all depends on context, essentially. So why is synthesis important for knowledge translation? So this is taking all of the international literature and making sense of it so that we actually know we've got enough evidence, enough research to justify we should adopt the new practice or policy or whatever it is. And that's not to say that you shouldn't implement or act on the findings of a single study, but you just need to be careful because you may have just got those findings, as an error. And so the importance of replication. And so Jeremy Grimshaw argues that the unit of knowledge translation should actually be synthesis. Dissemination is the traditional notion, which is get the information out there, but thinking of it a little bit more in terms of, can we really be clear about the message and who's the target audience, and how are we going to get it to them in a format that would actually help them to make use of that information. Knowledge exchange, and then at CIHR, while I was there, it was, we used the term integrated knowledge translation, which was this notion of we need to break down the communities. And so we get knowledge users and the people who produce research working together, learning from each other, doing research that addresses the issues of those knowledge users, working in a more participatory way, and that would ultimately result in quicker, better uptake. And then ethically sound application of knowledge. So the application is essentially use, and you can get into, is use increased knowledge, which it could be, often referred to as conceptual knowledge use, enlightenment, for example, or is it actual behavior change, so instrumental knowledge use. And then ethically sound, the ethically sound is in the CIHR definition of KT, and I think is the only definition anywhere in the world that actually brings up the issue of ethics. So just thinking about that ethics piece, we're going to try this little poll. So for yourself, what's the most important ethical consideration related to implementation? So think of it in terms of find Waldo. So the attach intervention, we're going to pretend the study's over. We've got really good results. It's effective. We know it works well. We think it should go into practice. So is the ethical concern failure to implement actually denies people effective interventions? So it's an equity issue. There's opportunity costs because it always costs something to implement, and there's always more evidence-informed innovations that could be implemented than we have money to implement. So you have to pick between the attached intervention and maybe stroke exercise programs for stroke in the community. We don't have money to do both. So which one are we going to fund? And we know that both are effective and deal with different populations, and somebody is making those decisions. And then a third way ethics come into it is around the acceptability of the strategies. So how are we going to influence people to change their thinking and change their behavior? We could be quite coercive. And so it really depends on what's acceptable in terms legally, what are we allowed to do with people, but also all of the soft things around cultures and norms. So if we can try the poll, which one of those, when you think about implementation and the ethical considerations, is really the most important? Obviously, all three have implications.
All right, I launched the poll. Can everyone see it? I'm seeing voting, so the answer is yes. And Nicole, you should be able to vote now.
Okay, I hadn't anticipated the 60 seconds. So next time I do this, I'll be able to do a song and dance or something. Okay, so 57% of you thought it was about denying people effective care. One person thought the opportunity costs, and then 12 or 40% thinking about the ethical implications of the implementation strategies. That's really interesting. So I've not used a poll like this before in talks, but often managers go for the second one because they're actually confronted with people coming saying we need to implement something and are having to make decisions about, do we go with innovation 1 or innovation 2 or innovation 3, and all of them are meritorious. We've got good evidence they work, but we can't afford to do them all at the same time, which means if we pick the stroke example, then it would mean that the kids wouldn't be benefiting from getting access to attach. Okay, so I think we can move on. Oh, and I just wanted, for those who are more in the social science and humanities area, SHRC came up with their definition like last year, and so it's very similar to CIHR. So synthesis, dissemination. They put in transfer, which is dissemination, so that's a little bit confusing. And then they've got exchange, and then co-creation and co-production, which co-creation and co-production is essentially exchange in the knowledge translation world. Anyway, but what's interesting about their definition is they don't say why you do it. So if you remember back to the CIHR one, it's to improve the health of Canadians and improve the healthcare system. And it could be the same thing, right? To improve the social well-being of everybody, and to improve, educational systems, the justice system, and whatever. Okay. So knowledge translation and there's quite a few of little bits of knowledge here that is kind of confused. It's not really confusing, but it's just lots of pieces, and I apologize for that. But so if we think of the concept of knowledge translation or knowledge mobilization, divide it in your head between the practice, so doing it, versus the study of it, so the science. And so when we think about the practice, the World Health Organization talks about the no-do gap, the evidence practice gap. So what do we know from the literature, from research, and what are we doing? And how do we actually get those to be in sync with each other? Because we often do more than what's actually than what we have evidence for, essentially. So they talk about reducing the no-do gap. Each of these bullets actually are saying it in a slightly different way. Making users aware of knowledge and facilitating the use of it to improve health and health systems. So, and it could be the adoption of something or the de-adoption. And so, you know, here, find Waldo. Think about it in terms of the attach intervention. Transforming evidence into practice, moving knowledge to action, moving the attach intervention into practice, and then the science of knowledge translation or implementation science, and that will come in a little bit more, so just hold on if you can't. So more lists of things to try to keep in your head. 3 categories. So I find this really helpful because often you get into discussions about knowledge translation and somebody's actually talking about what do you do when you have findings at the end of your study, which is the traditional thing, which is we publish a paper and we present it at a conference, essentially, or many people do that, and there's nothing wrong with that. But that's kind of their worldview of what knowledge translation is. And then the integrated knowledge translation, which is really about how you approach your research, how you engage those knowledge users in the research process, not as participants, not as subjects, although they may be, but how do you have them on the team? How do you work with the knowledge users to make sure that the questions are really the important ones that they need and want answers? And then the third category is this notion of implementation science. So really trying to figure out how can we efficiently and effectively promote the uptake of research or knowledge in decision making and in practice and policy, for example. So another set, and there seems in the area, things are often in 3s. So again, this comes from Jonathan Lomas decades ago, but I find it a really good taxonomy to think about. So diffusion, let it happen. You publish a paper, it's up to people to find the paper to make use of it. So really not that great because you have no control over whether anybody can find the paper, let alone access it. But with the open access policies for funders, at least you don't have to pay to get access to many of the papers now. So dissemination, think of it as helping it happen. So what's the message? Who's the audience? How are you going to get it to them? And that's kind of like what we do with advertising, right? Like very targeted. And so, or social marketing. And so it's still no guarantee that our results will actually get to the people that we hope, or that they will read them or find out about them. But at least we're targeting the people we think could benefit from using them. And then if you up the intensity, you've got the actual application or implementation. And so that's about making it happen. And so all of the implementation science world is actually trying to come up with knowledge that we can use to better engineer the uptake of research findings. And find Waldo. This actually comes from the grant proposal, Appendix 8. And what I want you to look at is this outer ring. And so this is the end of grant. So press releases, lay summaries, opinion and editorials, trade journals, in-services, conferences. So the in-services and the conferences and the training and implementation are getting more into the category of implementation. Peer-reviewed publications, right? So that would be more the diffusion, infographics, web postings, listservs, Facebook, Twitter, more the dissemination. So you're actually getting it to the people that you want, policy recommendations. So you can see that all the categories of end of grant KT activities span diffusion, dissemination, implementation. And then look in the middle. So this is the integrated KT piece. And this is about, well, we need to make sure that we're engaging all of our end users, our knowledge users, so that when we're producing the press releases, we're actually using languages and signaling the right communities, because all of our partners have helped us create all of these things. So we know that the messages are right for the audiences that we're wanting to get them to. And our knowledge users are actually helping us with their networks to disseminate and implement at the same time. So, and you can jump in at any time, Nicole, when I have misinterpreted things. So the second category, integrated knowledge translation. So a few definitions. We like this one because it's ours, but you don't have to like it. Is a model of collaborative research where researchers work with knowledge users to identify a problem and are in a position to act on the research findings. So the nuance here is we always think about stakeholders. So there's researchers and there's stakeholders. This is breaking down the stakeholder group to who would actually use the findings. So there may be lots of groups who are potentially interested in the findings and are a stakeholder, but they themselves would not use it. So for example, if it was a clinical trial, the results would be for clinicians to guide their practice and to interact with patients. So managers would not actually be doing the practice, the clinician would, but the manager is interested because they want to be evident, they want their staff to be evidence informed, they need to provide the resources and whatever. So just keep that in mind when you think about knowledge translation and this particular definition. So it's not a methodology, it's a way of thinking about how to conduct research. And really the purpose is to make the results more applicable to the knowledge users, the study population. And it's a paradigm shift from the traditional model of researcher curiosity-driven research. I get an idea, I apply to CIHR, my peers look at the idea, they think it's a good idea, I get it, I go off and do it. There's no requirement that you actually need to say this is an important, somebody thinks this is an important question, where with integrated knowledge translation, part of it is saying there are people who want this research conducted because it's going to help them in some way. Hopefully provide a solution to a problem that they've identified. So the first bullet is just to remind you that similar to the terminology around knowledge translation, with integrated knowledge translation, all of these terms kind of mean the same thing. They're more likely to mean the same thing than different. So collaborative, participatory, action-oriented, community-based research, engaged scholarship, mode 2 knowledge production, research co-production or co-creation. Indigenous health research could also fit into that, having to work with Indigenous communities. And so if we kind of think of the slogan that kind of captures it is this notion of nothing about me without me, which goes back to the disability community several decades ago, where people with disabilities were fed up with researchers getting grants, doing studies, involving them in studies, and they weren't actually studying issues that they were dealing with, struggling with, that they wanted the research to address. And they essentially said, stop, we're not going to do this anymore with you unless you start to listen to us and do research that will produce research findings that are relevant. And so if we think of, well, who are those knowledge users or end users? They can be policy and decision makers from the community to the federal level, the public, patients, industry, clinicians, health system managers, even whole communities, as I mentioned in terms of Indigenous community. And here we go, find Waldo. When we think about this project, it's kids and parents and community agencies and health and social services and others as well. And with integrated KT, it can also be within research teams. If you're going beyond your own little discipline, there are other knowledge users. And And when I was at CIHR, it was fascinating to get basic scientists together with clinicians and health services researchers to then start talking about, well, what are the real issues? And I was in a meeting with surgeons and clinicians and basic scientists. And the basic scientists were developing some, biomarker for something. And the clinicians were saying, well, I'm not sure how that's going to actually work. But if you could find us something that could pick this up, this would be so much more helpful. And so by actually talking to each other, they were actually able to change the focus. So there's lots of engagement frameworks that are out there. This happens to be the one that I liked when I was at CIHR, and I was responsible for the citizen engagement framework, which preceded the strategy on patient-oriented research. And so the key thing when we talk about integrated knowledge translation is the partnering end. And why I like this visual is because of these big balls. And so when I was at CIHR, we were thinking of the big balls as being CIHR, but we can think of it as researchers. And even though this is about public engagement in general, as opposed to in research, that notion, if we think this ball is a researcher, this is dissemination. We send stuff out. This is more like we collect data from people. We do that all the time. They may not understand why we're interested in what we're interested in, but they're really cool and they go along with us and do it. Sometimes we actually have some dialogue, with people. And then the notion of, engage. And so this is where all of us are kind of in this, and it's an interdisciplinary team. But it's the size of the ball that's really interesting. And if we think the size of the ball is related to power, when we get to this concept of partnering, it's really about we're equal. And so, yes, we may be the researchers and technically the money has come to us. And so we do, in that sense, have more power, but we decide to operate the team as we're equals, and we will share decision-making and we will figure out how to do this. An interesting aside, so between the time I left before I left CIHR, the citizen engagement framework was all developed. It had been designed and it was ready to go, and I left CIHR, and then it was kind of officially endorsed and published. If you go back to the document, this 5th level of partnership, the president at the time had them remove it from the document because he said CIHR is the big elephant here, and we will always be the big elephant, and we will never pretend to be equal to any of the other partners in this. So just a little interesting aside. So why integrated knowledge translation? So we're starting to get data that a really critical factor in influencing the uptake of research findings is actually having knowledge users prioritizing, defining, and interpreting the research. So if you do research that's actually addressing their needs, and depending on what the findings are, they're much more likely to use them. And if we think of ATTACH, at the end of this study, when we know how well ATTACH works, everybody that's been involved will continue to use ATTACH and be encouraging everybody else to also start doing it as well. As opposed to, we could create a brilliant intervention, then we come to you saying, here, we've got a solution for you. And what often happens is the knowledge users say, well, that's really nice. Thank you for coming. That's not our problem. This is our problem. Get us a solution for this. So what would make a study an integrated knowledge translation approach? So knowledge users and researchers working together to shape the research questions, deciding on the methodology, helping to collect the data, tools, development, selection of the outcome measures, interpreting the findings and crafting the message. So this is why it becomes so important. The knowledge users come from the community, the tribe, and so they know how they talk and how they think and how to present things in ways that they really understand, as opposed to researchers who, if left to their own devices, because we publish in journals that are preoccupied with statistics, would be saying, you know, the 95% confidence intervals or whatever, and not actually telling you, you know, what do you need to do. So doesn't necessarily mean that knowledge user involvement needs to be involved in every phase of the research, but it should mean asking knowledge users about how and when they want to be involved. So the ATTACH project, really founded on the principles of an integrated KT approach, clearly identified knowledge users, right? Parents and kids, community agencies and service providers. There's 4 principal knowledge users named on the grant. That's quite uncommon to have as many as 4, but this is the recognition of those end users of this intervention need to be fully engaged in the running of the project to make sure that we get findings that will actually help them in what they need to do. The governance structures focused on authentic user engagement. So there's the Parent Engagement Committee, as you know, the Community Engagement Committee. Both of them are co-chaired by knowledge users to make sure that this, you know, equitable shared decision making is actually built into the governance structures. And then, as I have already mentioned, on top of that, to make sure that, you know, the outputs of the grant are as useful and usable as they possibly can be, an IKT approach is being used to develop those when the time comes. And another page from the grant, a deliverable. So we're going to be held accountable for high quality integrated knowledge translation. And you can see the number of actions that are going to that. The last one, right, co-create KT products, including presentations, manuscripts, and infographics. So poll number 2, using an integrated knowledge translation approach, do you think that it produces more relevant research for knowledge users? Do you think it results in mutual learning between researchers and knowledge users? Do you think it produces real world impact? Is it all of those, or is it only A and C?
All right, sorry, I am just pushing buttons. You should now have the poll.
Looking like a landslide.
All right, I'm going to end the polling then.
Perfect. Thank you very much. So all of the above. Okay. Let's see. So this is the program theory. So through authentic and egalitarian partnerships with knowledge users, the research is strengthened. So knowledge user involvement, find Waldo, in developing the research question means that the research is more likely to be solutions-based, which means it's going to be more relevant. And this isn't to, don't misinterpret, curiosity-driven research is really important too, but on the applied side, which is often where knowledge translation sits, right? It's about getting answers to problems that we have so that we can deal with the solutions. Knowledge user engagement in the research process, so actually being part of the research team, increases the confidence that knowledge users have in the results. So they are more likely to believe them because they've been part of the process. They understand why methodological decisions may have happened. They also have more confidence in the researchers because they've developed a trusting relationship. And there's been mutual learning. So the researchers have learned from the knowledge users, the knowledge user context, and the knowledge users hopefully have learned a little bit more about research and why the importance of rigor and things that you can't slack on, and other things that maybe you can cut some corners without, you know, reducing the rigor of what you're doing. And then knowledge user engagement means readiness for the results and willingness to move them into practice. So think about it. If you're the knowledge user, you've identified this as an issue, you're part of the research team that's trying to find a solution for it, as soon as the results come out, assuming that they've, you know, been demonstrated positive in some way, you're going to act on them. You've been waiting for the findings. You need them. And that will happen more quickly and result in improved health and social care and health and well-being and potentially societal outcomes. And here's another find, Waldo. In the grant proposal, those outcomes, the impact that we're hoping to be able to demonstrate is child development, attachment, health broadly, immune health, and then it's not an outcome of the study, but in the rationale for why to pay attention to this, the notion that if this intervention actually works well for kids, that may improve their educational success, which could also have implications for employment successes, which are societal, right? Nothing to do with health. We've got a better educated workforce and employed and paying taxes and all of those kinds of things. So huge implications when you think. So that's the rationale for why we think it's really important to engage knowledge users in the research process. So that third category of things we're getting our way through. So the scientific study of methods to promote the uptake of research findings into routine healthcare, but it doesn't have to be healthcare. This definition is from the journal Implementation Science. So that's why it's into routine healthcare and clinical, and I can't see what's on the other side of that, organizational and policy context. So the field, it's not a discipline yet. I think it's more just a field, is theoretically pluralistic and uses mixed methods. And it has its own theories and frameworks, and it draws on all sorts of other ones from all sorts of discipline. Rogers' diffusion of innovations, the knowledge to action framework, the Paris framework. The normalization process theory is actually the one that's being used in this study to better understand the implementation aspects of the study. REAIM, which is an evaluation framework for uptake. Strong social science and behavioral science influence in the field. And which makes a whole lot of sense, because if you're thinking this is about behavior change, you want people who understand behaviors and societies and groups, because that's kind of what they study. So implementation research is the scientific study into questions concerning implementation, and it typically focuses on these two things: the determinants of knowledge use. So what are the barriers or facilitators of uptake? And the rationale being, if we can figure those out, we can actually manipulate them to improve the uptake. And then studies looking at the effectiveness of implementation strategies. So doing studies, using different strategies to see, is this an efficient way to get nurses to change their practice? Is this an efficient way to reach policymakers so that research will affect policymakers? And in the field of implementation science, as with the ATTACH project, it's using an integrated KT approach. So it's implementation science using an IKT approach. But often in the literature, it's scientists doing experiments, and they don't engage in the same way that knowledge users are being engaged in the ATTACH project. So what do we know from implementation science about the determinants? So there's three big categories, and these come from the Ottawa Model of Research Use, but there's kind of consensus about them. So the innovation, the thing, right? The evidence, it could be a practice guideline, it could be a policy. Oh, there's Waldo again. The ATTACH intervention is the innovation, potential adopters, and the context or setting. And so we go through that quickly. What do we know influences the uptake of innovations? How people think it was developed, and the attributes of the innovation. And so these are the characteristics that we know empirically can improve people's perception. So are the developers credible? Have they included all the right stakeholders? Was the process objective and rigorous? Is there careful documentation so you know exactly what happened? Was there involvement, local involvement? When you have these things, the chances are people are going to say, we like this innovation. We like how it was developed. As opposed to, we have no idea how it developed and where it came from. Then the perception of the attributes. So this is, think about this in terms of you deciding to, buy a car, something at your work that requires making a decision about an uptake and new software. We know things like relative advantage. So Is the innovation, do you perceive it to be useful? And that could mean it's cheaper than how you do it. It's better than the way you do it. There's some other advantage to doing it. If you don't think it has any relative advantage, I'm going to have a harder time convincing you to adopt this new thing, because you're going to say, well, what's the point? What I'm doing is fine. Low complexity. So the simpler it is to do, the easier it is for people to uptake. But that all of these things doesn't mean, even if you didn't have any of these, you couldn't convince people to do it. It just means it may be harder. Compatible. Does it fit with the way we do things now, with our norms and values? Is it going to require a whole lot of change? Think about the attach innovation, right? In terms of these characteristics. Trialability. People don't like to commit. So let's try it out, see how it goes. Then we can decide, gosh, it's easier than we thought, or, oh my God, this is terrible. We're never going to do this again. So if you frame it as, let's try it, people are more likely to go along with it than to say, okay, this is what you have to do, and we're not discussing this anymore. And skilled managers, you'll see this all the time. They'll bring something in and say, well, let's do a little pilot, see how it is. In their head, this was the first step to implementation. Everybody else is going, well, we could try it, I guess, and see how it goes. It needs to be clear. People need to know what it is you want them to do. If they're not clear, then that's another impediment. And then this is evidence from Holland and family doctors and guidelines, but they were more likely to adopt guidelines that were evidence informed. And I think increasingly everywhere in society, the importance of being evidence informed is there and is a positive aspect. And when you think of the attach intervention, all of the pilot studies and work that went into getting it to the state where it could be then tested in this study, all of that was, cumulative building of the evidence. So now think of yourselves. You're having to make some kind of a decision about the uptake of something. You need to know about it. Ideally, have positive attitudes and intentions. You need to know, you need to have the knowledge and the skills. And then there may be things that are worrying you that can get in the way. So we need to be attentive to all of these things as well. And then when we think about the practice environment, there are structural factors. And I have my eye on the time, so I'm just going to skip through these. The slides will be available to you. There's social factors, culture and belief systems, right? Did a project, family-centered maternity care, 2 maternity units, same hospital, different campuses, went in to see what was going on. One of them said, oh, we're so excited, we're innovative, we like to be the first to do things, we've embraced these guidelines, this is all the stuff that we're doing. The other unit, what's going on, how are you implementing? We don't like change, and we're not that keen on these guidelines, but we, are forced to do this. And so we feel really, really good. Our big activity was, somebody brought in a brick from home and we've propped open the door to the maternity unit so people can come in whenever they want. And that was for them, family-centered maternity care. So huge difference in culture, right? And you need to take that into account. And then there's other factors. So clients, consumers, patients, their behaviors, attitudes, preferences, pressures, right? If parents across the country find out about attach and then start lobbying everybody saying, we want access to this, well, that's going to happen a lot sooner than if nobody's talking about it. And then economic considerations, who's paying for what, right? If people have to do things and they're not being paid, that's a bit of a problem. And that's going to be a big barrier. So do you need to pay attention to remuneration? And then in healthcare, it's medical legal issues, right? Everyone's concerned about being sued if something terrible happens. So we won't do the poll, but I want you to think about this. So thinking about the attach intervention and its implementation a couple of years from now when the study's done, what do you see as the top barrier? Is it the complexity of doing the intervention? Service providers' knowledge and skills to deliver it? Parents and kids maybe not engaging with the intervention or not seeing its importance? Competing work pressures? Community agency culture? And so the whole area around, determinants of knowledge use become really important. So What do we know from implementation science about the effectiveness? So there's 3 spots I would send you to. So the Cochrane Collaboration, which is an international group of researchers that do systematic reviews of everything under the sun. Surprise, surprise, there's a group that's Effective Practice and Organization of Care. And there's a consumer and communications group. And so that's a beautiful place to start looking for systematic review evidence about what do we know about the effectiveness of interventions to change practice and behavior. And so the EPOC group focuses on professional, organizational, financial, and regulatory interventions, and they have over 200 systematic reviews that are continually updated. And we don't need to go through the list, but educational meetings, audit and feedback, patient-mediated strategies, mass media, for example. So these are all areas there are systematic reviews. Revisions to professional roles, quality improvement processes, changing in health record systems. And then there's the financial and regulatory interventions. And guess what? If you can change the law and make it mandatory for everybody to use ATTACH, that's way easier than trying to convince them to do it. But it's a huge hammer that you need to use very cautiously. The consumer group may be relevant to you too, because while it's typically about patients, it's about what do we know about effective strategies to influence consumer behavior, patient behavior. And so, you know, one of their reviews shows that, and you know this if you've been to hospital, what do they give you when you're leaving? A pile of paper of things you need to do for self-management. Giving people pieces of paper with information on it does not change behavior. But we have whole departments in hospitals that are producing photocopies of these pieces of paper. CADTH is the Canadian Agency for Drug Technology and Health. And several years ago, they took the EPOC group and the consumer group and they put it together and then produced these beautiful overviews assessing the quality of the systematic reviews. They haven't updated it in 7 years, but the reviews often in these areas don't change a whole lot. But it's a good place to start to see, has there been, you know, like 7 years ago, was there any evidence? And then you can look for more recent systematic reviews. So we won't do this, but I want you to think about it. What's the effectiveness of educational meetings? So think about this. This is an educational meeting, right? So this talk. So it's not at all effective. And I can tell you there are trials that show giving the talk versus not, like people having the talk versus not having the talk made them dumber. So hopefully this isn't an outcome of this. So I only started with not at all effective, 2% effective, 6%, 10%, 15%, or more than 15. So what I mean by effectiveness is if you get the educational intervention versus not getting the educational intervention, you know more or you change your behavior by 2%, 6%. Trick question. So it's effective for what? And I gave that away. Is it for knowledge, right? So if you think schools, they have tests, what are they measuring? Knowledge. Or are we actually wanting to influence action, practice, behavior? And we know there's a disconnect between the two. So you can know all sorts of stuff, but that doesn't mean you act on that information. So we can't assume that just because people are knowledgeable, it makes a difference. So if our assumption is that education is going to change behavior, maybe we need to think a little bit more broadly than that. So what do we actually know? What's the right answer? The median effect is 6%, not very much. Look down this column. The median effect, 5, 4, 6, 4.8, generally effective. So the ballpark is virtually any intervention is between 5 and 10% effective, roughly. And you can say, oh my God, I told you behavior change is almost impossible. Why do we bother? Or you could say, oh my God, 5%. If we were selling a drug and we could get 5% of the market, we'd be billionaires, right? The other thing I just wanted to point out quickly, so audit and feedback, there's been 100, and this was in 2012, 118 randomized control trials and 35 reviews. Educational meetings, 81 randomized control trials and nearly as many systematic reviews. Distribution of educational materials, I love this one, 12 randomized control trials and 50 reviews. reviews are really important, but why do we need 50 reviews of 12 trials? And they included other studies. And these are, what do we know? Communication. So this is an interesting one that may be more relevant to this group. Communication before a consultation. So this is having, the studies are patients before they see their clinician are given communication about different things. 33 randomized controlled trials. It increases the likelihood that they'll ask questions when they see the clinician, increases their participation, and improves their reported patient satisfaction. So there's lots of evidence out there of things that we can do and how well they work. So the implementation science side, surprisingly, use exactly the same methods for the most part. So randomized control trials. So some people get the intervention, some people don't at random. More interested in cluster trials. And so this is the notion, if you think of schools, for example, or agencies, you wouldn't want to randomize within a classroom, because some kids would get the intervention and some wouldn't, and they'd be mixing with each other and they'd be talking to each other. And if it's the same teacher, how are they going to make sure that only some kids get the intervention and some don't? So the notion of cluster is we'll keep the classroom as the group, the cluster, and we'll randomize classroom. So everybody in the same group gets the same intervention. And so when you think about implementation studies, the cluster trials are pretty important. Step wedge is the notion of it's unethical for us to actually randomize agencies to things because everyone's going to get the intervention. And so if you have enough time, the step wedge is each group is their own control, and we launch one group and we do a pre-post with them and we wait a little bit of time and then we launch the second one. So it might take us 2 years to get all of them up and running, but then we compare them over time. And if something happened like COVID, we could see if that was different for the groups that went before COVID versus the ones after. Interrupted time series. So this is a cohort and you just follow the one group typically over time and take multiple measurements. Then the control before after. So you've got one group that's the control, one group gets the intervention, and you just compare them. So they haven't been randomized. And then there's the before after, pre-test, post-test. And so there's no control group. Everybody gets the intervention. And you're looking at what happened before and comparing it to what happened after. And here here's Waldo again. So agency A, B, and C, there's a pre-test. The intervention is the COVID intervention, and then the COVID intervention, the attach intervention, and then the post-test. And we sum the blues and the oranges and compare the two, and hopefully we'll be able to declare on all of the outcomes that we're interested in, which ones have actually improved in the way that we hope that they would. Not to say that implementation scientists don't like to be really geeky and make it even worse. There's 3 types of hybrid studies. So these are trying to do the implementation and study the implementation at the same time. So that the type 1 is to determine the effectiveness and collect some information on context. Hybrid type 2, determine the effectiveness and then look at feasibility of implementation or the effectiveness of implementation. And then type 3 is actually interested more in the intervention, the implementation, but they'll collect data. So this is what attach is. It's a hybrid type 2. So going to figure out if the intervention's effective, but at the same time, in parallel, collecting data on what are the issues around implementation. And then if it doesn't get complicated enough, this is kind of a really geeky study where they've then taken the 3 types and they've added a gazillion more types to it. And I don't understand it, but whatever. So at this point, you're saying, oh, the time is up. And so when you go to these slides, you'll see that these are the objectives to test the effectiveness. So parent-child relationship quality, parental reflective function, how does the intervention work for what kinds of people, and then the immune biomarkers. And then these are the feasibility related to the implementation. And this is a pitch for the upcoming series. So all the ones that have stars, there's actually going to be a webinar on integrated KT, parent or patient engagement, normalization process theory. So think about this presentation, what I've said. So do you think the impact on you is 0, 2%, 6%, 10%, or more than 15%? So apologies, I didn't have it quite timed and I didn't build in how long it would take to do the polls.
No worries. Thank you so much for that wonderful talk, Ian. I do want to, do you have to go anywhere right away, or do you have some time to answer some questions?
No, I can answer some questions.
Brilliant. Okay. So if you do have to leave, that's okay. We're going to be posting this online, so you'll be able to hear the answers to the questions. And I don't want to keep you too long over the hour, but there were a couple questions that popped up. So let me just scroll back and take a quick look at those. Again, online, thank you very much. Okay, so there was one question that was asking about evidence showing that IKT approaches do produce more real-world impact. So that is, do interventions tested with IKT approaches get taken up and used more in practice and have better outcomes compared to, for example, diffusion approaches or other traditional approaches?
Yeah, I would send you to the CIHR website. If you Google CIHR KT program evaluation, probably the best evaluation of IKT in the world to date is there. And that happened when I was at CIHR, because there were actually at that point in time funding opportunities that required knowledge users to actually be co-principal investigators or co-investigators. And so they looked at, what do we know? So compared to the curiosity driven, surprise, surprise, women are more likely to work or to have been funded in an IKT kind of way. And I think that makes sense, because if you connect it to ability to communicate and interpersonal skills and emotional intelligence, sometimes women are a little bit better at that. So that may account for that. The other thing, you get as many publications with doing it in an IKT approach as you would if you were doing curiosity driven research. And in fact, on average, for $100,000, you get 4 publications and typically 2 reports, because you're working with your knowledge users. So go to the CIHR website, CIHR KT program evaluation, and you can look at the data.
Thank you for that. We have another question. Susanna, can you nod? Are you okay if I give you mic access to ask your question?
Sure.
Okay, and that was, so there was a question about mode 2 knowledge production. Did you want to explain that a little bit more?
Well, yeah, Ian, I actually just wanted to know what that meant in your slide.
Yep. So that's from the UK. And the guy's name is eluding me right at the moment, but it was this notion of comparing, and Carol Estabrooks at University of Edmonton in the School of Nursing actually did a study of this several years ago, but it's that notion of working with the knowledge users as part of the team and making sure that the research was responding to them, and they called it mode 2 knowledge production. And then since then they've gone on to mode 3 and 4 and 5, and I never remember which is which, but essentially it's the notion of a participatory approach.
Okay, that's great. Thank you very much.
And I have one more question for you, Ian. And again, if you have any questions, feel free to pop them into the chat, and I'll be able to see them and I can read them to Ian. So there's another comment here. Thank you for a great talk. I'm curious if the research practice gap is still about 17 years. And I was also wondering about ways to address barriers to uptake that are more so systemic, like policy or budget.
Yeah, really good question. So the statistic that we all know about the 17 years, it's not actually 17 years. So that review kind of said on average. And so some things are taken up way quicker than that. And then some of them can be even longer. And so it's interesting how that 17 years has become like everybody knows the 17 years. So I don't think there is research. They haven't redone that review to see, is the 17 years shortening. we did a study where we were trying to look at, for end-stage lung and breast disease, how long did it take for findings that were published as an abstract to get into a paper with the full results to then be cited in a practice guideline? And it was somewhere between 4 and 8 years. So in oncology, in specifically terminal areas, which you may not, which isn't surprising given people are desperate because nothing works. It was way shorter than the 17 years. So it's a good empirical question. If we could get master's and PhD students, they could be picking off pieces of that, and those would be good ones. The financial piece is huge. We do have a fair bit of evidence that if you pay people to do things, they will do it. And as soon as you stop paying them, they go back to the way it was before. So from an evidence-based or evidence-informed practice perspective, we really want people to be adopting things because they think it's the right thing to do, and that they, are wanting to use the evidence to guide their practice or their policy decisions, not that they're motivated, for love of money. And the policy piece, that's growing in the US. There's now a policy implementation science kind of movement that's happening because the issues, the barriers, and the facilitators are so different at the policy level than it is at the practice level. So I think over the next few years, we will see this a lot, and especially following Trump and kind of how the systems can be totally corrupt, and the importance of going back to making sure that we have evidence-informed policy as opposed to just people making, willy-nilly decisions.
I think we had a reference for the shorter time frame, 5 to 8 years. That was, which paper was that again, did you say?
So I said it was a project. I'm not sure the paper has been published. Jeremy Grimshaw is the first author, or he was the PI. I was the co-PI, but I went to CIHR then, so I didn't follow through on the rest of it. But I will check to see if it's been published.
Okay, and I'm going to take advantage of the fact that I'm the organizer and throw in the last question here. Then, so one of my challenges, Ian, and this might be a scary question, so I'm so sorry. I was raised research-wise in programs that did not think about knowledge users and knowledge translation in this way. Like, it was really just diffusion. So when I started working with Nicole, the idea of doing this sort of work was absolutely terrifying because I did not have the background or skills or connections to reach out to, ironically, to reach out to the people that my work is supposed to be helping with. So I might be of the generation that kind of missed that in graduate studies, but do you have any advice for people that came from that very, curiosity-driven approach to research, but really feel like they need to do more of this?
Yeah, so and there are a lot of people who have come up in similar traditions, who are open-minded and are willing to think about it, but it's just, they don't know where to start. And so I would say, when you think about your research, think about those knowledge users and just start talking to them. So there's a biomedical researcher in Australia, I think John Lynch maybe, and he discovered something related to lysosomal somethings and generated $80 million in revenue, in royalty. And I was at the South Australian Health Medical Research Institute, helping them with their knowledge translation strategy. And so 90% of it was biomedical research. And so I talked to everybody, I came up with it. And one of the platforms was integrated KT, essentially. And so lots of the people said that we don't do that. Who would we talk to? It's fine for the clinicians. They interact with patients. We don't even know what to do. Anyway, I came across this guy and I was worried he was going to say that I was kind of nutty. And he said, you know what? If I had my will, every biomedical researcher would have to talk to people who ultimately might benefit from what it is they're doing. Because the reason I made the discovery that I made was because I started to go to the clinic and talk to the kids and talk to the clinicians and start to understand their issues. So it didn't change his science per se, but it changed how he thought about the experiments so that they could provide information that might be more useful along the way. So I think once people start interacting with knowledge users, and I don't mean to depersonalize them like that, but they can actually see that they're not, the people are not that scary, and their lived experience, whether they're clinicians or parents or patients or managers, can really be insightful. So that would be the baby step I would start with. Start talking to people who potentially, you know, could be considered knowledge users of your work, and see what they're thinking. What are they saying? I've been in research meetings with patients because it's patient oriented, and we've gone around the table saying, you know, we're going to do a trial of something. And then I've said to the patient, so what do you think is important? And it happened where everybody was saying, well, you know, it's pain. And the patient said, well, actually, it's fatigue. And nobody had bothered to ask. And I mean, that's in the literature as well, in rheumatology or some area. So little things like that, right? So like trialists, are they talking to potential patients who would be in their trials to find out from them, what do they think the outcome measures are, you know, important to them? We did a bandaging trial, and we went to the managers and clinicians because we were trying to figure out how to power the trial. And we could have done it on healing rates. And the manager said, well, it depends on what it's going to cost. So one of them was the bandage was more expensive, but less nursing time. The other one was more expensive. So more expensive, less nursing time, less expensive, more nursing time. So they said you could use either of them until the cheapest one happened. So we said, okay, we'll power it based on this administrative outcome. And CIHR couldn't get their head around that the first time around, because it was like, well, it should be just on which one heals better. And then we argued, well, the manager said it didn't matter how well they healed. It was the healing in relation to how much it cost. And nursing is a limited supply. So they wanted to conserve nursing, save money, and have better healing rates. Anyway, and so the second time around, we were successful. So even little things like that can, you know, start.
I will take that in mind. It's still a little scary, but thank you for your response.
I'm here. I can hold your hand.
Okay, I appreciate it. Very much appreciate it. All right. Well, we're about 15 minutes over, and I want to be conscious of everyone's time. But again, everyone, online class, thank you very much for your talk today, Dr. Graham. That was wonderful. We are going to be posting the slides and the talk for the team and online, and we will take care of that and send you the link to how you can find that. Are you okay with us sharing your email address so people can
yes,
email
absolutely.
you?
Yep. Anybody
Okay.
has questions, please email me.
Okay, we're all waving at Caden. All right. Thank you very much. You're getting lots of compliments, and I will let everyone go. So we're going to have our next talk then, the end of February, last Friday, and that's going to be patient engagement. There'll be information for how to register for that coming out shortly. All right.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Okay. Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.